Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, Alberton spill victims recounted their experiences with Montana Rail Link claims agents, and we looked at the case to be made for exposure to chlorine and other chemicals in the Alberton spill. We now continue with Part 6, Chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4, The Literature. Epigraphs. The literature suggests that the majority of exposed persons will recover completely. Dr. Leda Koken of the Poison Control Center. We didn't have much of anything about long-term consequences. Ellen Leahy, director of the Missoula City County Health Department. Our findings add to a growing body of publications suggesting that all exposure to chlorine and chlorine dioxide be avoided. From a 1994 study. After proving exposure came proving effects. All too often, studies depended on tragedy. By 1996, chlorine use had increasingly pervaded society for 100 years, and yet, knowledge of the effects on human beings remained incomplete and controversial. Guidelines were developed mainly for occupational workers and protocol for exposure treatment, but much uncertainty regarding chronic health effects remained. Alberton spill victims would argue, don't just cite the literature, look at us. A brief history of chlorine. Following the discovery of elemental chlorine in Sweden in 1774, early investigation of the effects on humans was sparse. Chlorine is toxic, and it is unethical to use human beings in controlled studies at significant doses. The bulk of information on health effects has derived from chlorine use as a weapon and from accidental and occupational exposures. The concentration is usually unknown in human exposures, and dose-response guidelines are very much estimates. Chlorine gas was first used as a weapon in 1915 during World War I. Various gases injured over 70,000 U.S. soldiers. While the 1925 Geneva Protocol banned chlorine gas in warfare, chlorine continues to be used as a weapon of choice and opportunity. Chlorine use greatly expanded after World War II with the advent of synthetic chemicals. Thousands of workers in the U.S. chemical, paper, textile, and water treatment industries receive at least minor exposure to chlorine gas each year. In the 1990s, chlorine and hydrochloric acid ranked first and third in cause of injuries and deaths from large accidents involving industrial chemicals. More commonly, the misguided mixing of household bleach and ammonia produces toxic levels of chloramine gas. Few chlorine studies on humans have been controlled, except at low levels of exposure. The OSHA permissible exposure limit of 0.5 parts per million for 8 hours is based in part on 2 controlled exposure studies at 0.5 and 1 parts per million with a small sample of healthy, non-smoking men. One of these studies' authors warned in 1983 the long-term effects of such low concentrations remain to be elucidated. The long-term effects of higher concentrations likewise remain unclear. Additionally, occupational studies of environmental exposure can't be simply extrapolated to general society, since many workers who are intolerant to health effects are weeded out from the workforce. Workers also exclude the youngest, oldest, and least healthy members of society. Uncertainty. The literature. World War I studies listed death and various respiratory problems associated with chlorine exposure, among other symptoms. A Canadian study of 700 chlorine-exposed soldiers determined that over 16% were disabled from working, mainly from heart trouble, asthma, and bronchitis. Some early researchers assumed full recovery would come, while others predicted permanent disability. One post-war study concluded that if full recovery didn't take place early on, the effects were long-lasting, if not permanent. World War I studies revealed little clinical evidence of destruction of lung tissue, and many early chlorine studies lacked physiologic corroboration. But one 1967 study by Kowitz suggested that inhalation of gas induced permanent pulmonary damage and disability that might be undetectable by routine clinical and radiological studies. Uncertainty. But in general, worldwide occupational studies from the 1940s into the early 1970s declared after effects of chlorine exposure to be, quote, few and trivial, despite occasional deaths. The evolved reputation of acute chlorine exposure was that you either died immediately, a rare occurrence since World War I, or you recovered completely. There was little in between. In 1967, researchers Kowitz et al. Decried there was no objective evaluation of the immediate or long-term effects of chlorine gas inhalation on human lung function. They cited how opinions on chlorine exposure had become progressively optimistic of human recovery, despite the paucity of data. Coinciding with the mushrooming development of the chlorine industry after World War II, later studies were more skeptical of chronic effects, many stating there was no evidence of permanent damage. But these newer opinions worked on the following assumption. Presumptive evidence of such injury can be established only by a clear-cut history of heavy exposure, whatever that meant. Studies were mainly retrospective reviews, and the dose couldn't be proven. Followed by immediate severe symptoms requiring hospitalization and characterized thereafter by an unbroken train of signs and symptoms of respiratory disease, Kowitz noted. This sounded very much like the Alberton presumption. Only those people with an undetermined severe exposure and immediate severe injury might develop long-term problems. Were the limited studies missing more subtle disease? The in-between? Kowitz questioned assumptions that chlorine generally produced no long-term effects, especially considering the scant data. Others agreed. Kaufman wrote in 1971, "No studies covering a large number of individuals immediately following acute chlorine exposure have been reported." In a 1976 review, NIOSH concluded there was not enough evidence to determine whether there was a potential for chronic impairment of pulmonary function following acute or chronic chlorine exposure. Again, uncertainty. Despite scant studies and study limitations, despite mixed results and caveats, the prevailing view emphasized that most people showed no chronic effects. According to a 1990 review contracted by the Chlorine Institute, most studies of occupational long-term exposures revealed no chronic effects. But what were most studies looking for? In a 1994 study that found chronic illness after chronic low-level exposure, the authors noted that in similar past studies, assessment of nonspecific bronchial responsiveness had not been carried out to disclose the possibility of persistent asthma. Nonspecific bronchial responsiveness alluded to reactive airways disease, be it asthma, occupational asthma, or reactive airways dysfunction syndrome, RADS, also called irritant-induced asthma. Respiratory sensitivity. How few exposures could lead to a reactive airways disease? 1. Alberton was clearly an acute chlorine exposure, until it became more by claims of subsequent low-level exposures to chlorine, as well as to other chemicals on and beyond April 11. Some studies by the 1970s claimed measurable chronic respiratory effects from acute chlorine exposure, while others didn't, except for trivial effects like dyspnea or shortness of breath. By the 1980s, no studies had immediately followed up on a large number of people after a major acute chlorine exposure, an echo of Kaufman's summary from 1971. Notably, RADS was first medically described in 1985. The bulk of studies challenging the notion of no chronic effects from acute chlorine exposure have come since the mid-1980s, a trend towards showing chronic effects by the time of the Alberton spill. As with respiratory effects, part of the reason for scarcity of evidence of other chronic effects of chlorine exposure has been scarcity of studies. A 1992 review noted that acute chlorine exposure was known to cause keratitis, conjunctivitis, and blepharitis, but clinical studies apparently did no long-term follow-up on these symptoms, echoing Missoula ophthalmologist Dr. Rick Neumeister's literature review for chronic eye injury. Neumeister and ATSDR later confirmed chronic eye and skin symptoms. The literature told a story much more complicated than the pat assurances given Alberton spill victims that most everyone should have no chronic effects. By 1996, many researchers had established a link between acute exposure to irritants and chronic asthma-like symptoms, the general hallmark of RADS. Asthma in America has long been on the rise. Occupational asthma has long been recognized as a gradual development of asthma-like symptoms in workers after repeated low-level exposure to irritants, wherein victims become sensitized over time. Over 350 work-related chemicals have been associated with adult onset of asthma. Brooks et al. Coined the term RADS, reactive airways dysfunction syndrome, in a 1985 study. Brooks described 10 subjects who developed an asthma-like illness after a single exposure to high levels of an irritating vapor, fume, or smoke, they wrote. No subjects had a previous syndrome history, and their airways hyperreactivity lasted a year or longer. Such an irritant exposure can lead to chronic airways disease, Brooks wrote. One case involved a chlorine compound. The symptoms of RADS that Brooks noted, mainly coughing and shortness of breath, some subjects wheezed, a few exhibited chest pain and tightness, dizziness, severe headache, eye inflammation, tearing, rash, prickly face feeling, nausea, diarrhea, and muscle ache. Symptoms beyond the airways, general hypersensitivity. Subsequently, some subjects became sensitive to other stimuli, cold air, dusts, aerosols, smoke, fumes. Their airways hyperreactivity was not specific to the original chemical irritant. Notably, the subjects had originally received a variety of outside diagnoses from their doctors, ranging from chemical bronchitis to asthma to simply the flu. There was no apparent immunologic mechanism for RADS, Brooks said. Brooks speculated that perhaps adult-onset asthma cases were related to RADS and environmental exposures. It was not clear if RADS was a dose-effect phenomenon, absent a controlled test. Perhaps a low-level chronic exposure could cause a similar type process in some individuals, Brooks speculated. This sounded like occupational asthma. Subsequent chlorine studies built upon the acute exposure definition of RADS. A 1990 study on 2 subjects suffering an acute chlorine exposure reported the victims developed chronic RADS. In response to that report, another doctor reported on a chlorine exposure patient who now probably does have RADS, he said. In a 1990 follow-up study of temporary construction workers at a pulp mill, 20 healthy people had been briefly exposed to high concentrations of chlorine during a major leak. The 12-year follow-up on 13 workers found 3 had hyperreactive airways, and 2 had intermediate response to a methacholine test. The authors wrote, "Our findings suggest that short-term exposure to high concentrations of chlorine gas may lead to long-term respiratory complications." A 1994 study reported another case of RADS following a 5-minute domestic gas exposure of bleach mixed with hydrochloric acid. Other occupational studies in the 1990s prior to Alberton also found chronic respiratory disease following chlorine exposure. A related syndrome now identified was RUDS, reactive upper airways dysfunction syndrome, with symptoms such as burning sensation in sinuses and throat, congestion, runny nose, and sneezing, documented in 1994 and 1996. Post-Alberton, while chlorine studies remained opportunistic, research continued to document chronic effects from chlorine and other irritant gas exposures, including RADS, asthma, and RUDS. Studies arising out of the 2005 mass exposure Graniteville chlorine leak also indicated chronic respiratory illness. By the turn of the 21st century, chlorine gas was considered to be one of the most common offending agents that can cause RADS. A 2008 overview using Brooks' criteria for diagnosing RADS found chlorine as the most commonly reported chemical associated with RADS. Conclusions and caveats. The literature made clear that prior to the Alberton spill, chronic RADS could develop from chronic exposure or from a single acute exposure to irritant chemicals, including chlorine. Government agency files reflected this awareness, including the Montana Department of Environmental Quality and ATSDR, which cited pre-Alberton and post-Alberton studies. Chlorine exposure can trigger RADS in people with or without prior asthma history and can aggravate so-called resolved childhood asthma. Furthermore, people with RADS or asthma can become susceptible to a broad spectrum of irritants, one hallmark of multiple chemical sensitivity. This information was established prior to the Alberton spill, even if a more recent trend, and continues to be documented. Was it fair for public health officials to say the vast majority of victims of a single acute chlorine exposure should experience no chronic effects? Or to state that there was no evidence in the literature for a connection between acute chlorine exposure and chronic symptoms? With Alberton, these were the assumptions put forth by officials and many doctors, and they became an integral part of MRL's defense against medical claims. Yet, many studies have indeed documented chronic effects from both acute and chronic exposures, and many authors had questioned assumptions while stressing the lack of knowledge and the need for more studies. Knowledge of chronic effects from chlorine exposure has been evolving. Doss and Blank cited in 1993 the growing number of reports of persistent changes following irritant inhalation. These reports, they said, document persistent asthmatic symptoms and nonspecific airways responsiveness following acute inhalational exposure either to chlorine gas, hydrochloric acid, or an unspecified bleaching agent. Additionally, they said, indeed, occupational asthma following a single exposure to chlorine gas may be more common than previously expected. A 1994 occupational study concluded, our findings add to a growing body of publications suggesting that all exposure to chlorine and chlorine dioxide be avoided. At the time of the Alberton spill, the medical literature revealed uncertainty about the chronic effects of chlorine exposure, with a trend toward evidence of chronic illness developing, whether from acute or chronic, low-level or high-level chlorine exposures. All such exposures were possible with the Alberton spill, and many Alberton victims developed chronic illness. In short, Alberton spill victims were underinformed by health officials about the risks to long-term health from their exposures, both during the evacuation and the years to follow. In litigation, MRL cited several older studies and reviews and some general prevailing assurances to conclude that the vast majority of Alberton victims would not be expected to have chronic health effects, and some local Missoula doctors as witnesses, as well as hired medical experts, concurred. Just as a close look at the literature should have informed doctors and government agencies about the risk of RADS from chlorine exposure, there existed a body of evidence concerning broader health problems, namely multiple chemical sensitivity. Chapter 5. MCS. Multiple chemical sensitivity, MCS, was well established as a syndrome prior to the 1996 Alberton derailment, amid a growing body of evidence, if often anecdotal. This chapter emphasizes issues of MCS in the 1990s. Among the many working definitions for MCS, M.R. Cullens is commonly cited. He wrote, multiple chemical sensitivities is an acquired disorder characterized by recurrent symptoms, referable to multiple organ systems, occurring in response to demonstrable exposure to many chemically unrelated compounds at doses far below those established in the general population to cause harmful effects. No single widely accepted test of physiologic function can be shown to correlate with symptoms. The EPA has qualified, there are different views among medical professionals about the existence, causes, diagnosis, and treatment of this condition. With growing acceptance, MCS was recognized by many government agencies by 1996. Yet, many American medical organizations still remain skeptical of MCS as a distinct disease. In fact, MCS has no official diagnostic criteria or tests, no widely accepted case definition, and no known etiology. The symptoms vary from person to person, and prevalence rates are uncertain. Prior to Alberton, only 2% of doctors in the U.S. were qualified to diagnose chemical poisoning and related problems. Physicians that didn't recognize MCS often referred patients to psychologists. Undisputed is that a segment of our population actively avoids exposure to chemicals at levels common in modern society, and in the most extreme cases, patients report being disabled. Many doctors and researchers have stated unequivocally that MCS is real and underdiagnosed. A checklist of reported MCS symptoms covers virtually the whole body. However, central nervous system symptoms, respiratory and mucosal irritation, and gastrointestinal problems appear to be the most common. Such multi-system symptoms were evident in many Alberton complaints. Triggers for recurring symptoms can be wide-ranging, including chlorine. Regardless of MCS, modern chemical exposures have demonstrably resulted in a wide range of acute and chronic health problems. But most people are frequently exposed to a myriad of chemicals at low levels, seemingly without ill effect. How does MCS develop in the first place? Generally, MCS develops in a two-step process of initiation and subsequent triggering. The initiation may result from an acute exposure to a specific toxin or from a chronic exposure to one or more toxic substances. Hypersensitivity develops after initiation, though the symptoms generally disappear when the irritant is removed. But subsequent exposures can lead to a spreading phenomenon of reaction to other chemicals. MCS patients develop various physical and neurological symptoms that surface upon re-exposure to those chemicals, even at common low levels. A specific mechanism remains unproven. Some theories have examined the role of inflammation of the airways, noting similarities with hyperreactivity of the airways and RADS. Some theories posit that MCS may have a cascading effect upon health. This could explain the wide variety of symptoms associated with MCS and the difficulty in agreeing on diagnostic criteria. But research has been limited. A competing theory is that MCS is all in one's head. But the real debate lies in whether psychiatric factors are the cause or predisposing factor or an effect of MCS. The support group Chemical Injury Information Network noted, "The chemical companies have a vested interest in promoting the belief that chemically induced health problems are more psychiatric in nature than a response to being poisoned by their products." It is the Chemical Manufacturers Association that stated in its 1991 briefing paper, "The primary impact on society would be the huge cost associated with legitimization of environmental illness." In 1998, the Interagency Workgroup on MCS summarized that the suggestion that psychiatric disorders are the basis of MCS has complicated communication between those who believe that, if present, psychiatric symptoms are a secondary accompaniment to a chronic disease process, and those who believe that MCS is primarily the symptomatic manifestation of a psychiatric disorder. Furthermore, both physical symptoms and accompanying psychiatric illness may result from a common underlying neurobiologic mechanism. Psychology aside, the brain is susceptible to chemical exposure and injury. Dr. Gunnar Heuser, a clinical neuro and immunotoxicologist in California who treated some Alberton patients, noted that the fastest entry for a chemical to the brain is via the nasal passages to the olfactory bulb, where there is no blood-brain barrier. Inhaled chemicals have access to the olfactory bulb, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Smell, emotion, and memory intertwined. The EPA, OSHA, and the American Lung Association concede that MCS should not be dismissed as merely a fear of toxic chemicals or a psychological reaction to modern-day stress. Key studies have proclaimed a physiologic origin to MCS symptoms. People in today's world are frequently exposed to a myriad of chemicals at low levels, seemingly without ill effect. Heuser thought, "Humans incur a lot of damage from chemical exposures that we are often unaware of." He wrote, "Patients with chemical sensitivity serve as indicators, you might say, of this phenomenon. They should be listened to because they are the ones that kind of warn us that things are not right. Canaries in the chemical mine." Diagnosis of MCS has been hamstrung by lack of definitive studies and even basic research. Government, industry, and established medicine have helped foster this inertia. One simple diagnostic tool for MCS is removal of the patient from suspected triggers, followed by observation for recovery followed by controlled reintroduction to triggers and observation for symptoms. As of 1996, there was no single case definition for MCS, but common elements were identified. They include: the disorder is acquired relative to a documentable exposure, chronic hypersensitivity more than 3 months to multiple chemicals at low levels considered safe, a multi-system disorder usually including the central nervous system, a range of sensitivity among individuals, and physical examination is often negative. No single test can explain the symptoms. In 1999, the first consensus definition of MCS was published, specifying 6 criteria for clinical diagnosis. 1. The symptoms are reproducible with repeated chemical exposure. 2. The condition is chronic. 3. Low levels of exposure, lower than previously or commonly tolerated, result in manifestation of the syndrome. 4. The symptoms improve or resolve when the incitants are removed. 5. Responses occur to multiple chemically unrelated substances. And 6. Symptoms involve multiple organ systems. But the Interagency Workgroup on MCS in 1998 emphasized that no test result or panel of results can currently identify MCS. As the Chemical Injury Information Network has framed the issue, the technology to prove chemically induced injuries is just beginning to catch up with the technology that created them. Various government agencies have called for research on MCS since the early 1980s. The aftermath of the 1990-91 U.S. Gulf War galvanized concern over MCS as many veterans returned with multi-system symptoms after experiencing various war-related exposures. In 1993, ATSDR assumed a leadership role in promoting scientific research in MCS, mostly in relation to communities with low-level exposure from toxic waste sites. Formed in 1995, the Federal Interagency Workgroup on MCS issued their draft report in the fall of 1998. The workgroup sought to jumpstart a flagging effort to investigate MCS. Despite calls for research, no federal department or agency had sponsored or conducted challenge studies. The workgroup saw MCS as a public health priority and recommended epidemiologic research, verified clinical reports, and basic biomedical research to develop a detailed strategic plan for MCS. The workgroup also found a need to better inform the healthcare community about MCS to help foster appropriate treatment. But by the turn of the century, little had been implemented. This inaction served the chemical industry well. Early prevalence data on MCS was very limited. Estimates of prevalence have varied widely depending on methodologies. Several statewide surveys found 3.1 to 6.3% of Americans reported diagnosis of MCS by a physician. In 1993, the California Department of Health Services developed MCS questionnaires, medical tests, and study designs for ATSDR in the event of a community-wide chemical spill. 4 questionnaires were developed: for a general population screening, for in-depth population-based research, for household screening in a post-spill situation, and for a follow-up questionnaire. ATSDR used none of these questionnaires following the Alberton spill, the very sort of event for which they were designed. In the 1995 test of the general population screening questions of 4,000 randomly selected California residents, 16% of survey participants reported sensitivities to common chemicals, and 6.3% claimed to have been diagnosed with MCS by a doctor. A 2003 study in Atlanta, Georgia, found a reported prevalence of hypersensitivity to common chemicals of 12.6%. Only 3.1% reported that they had been medically diagnosed. The study wrote, for a substantial number of the respondents, their hypersensitivity is disruptive and life-altering, and a majority experienced symptoms described as being either severe or somewhat severe. Furthermore, the difference between the pre-symptom and post-symptom findings weakens the notion that MCS is psychogenic or that a chemical hypersensitivity is a product of emotional disturbance. These findings indicate, in contrast, that the physical problems emerge first and emotional problems develop only afterward. It is plausible that hypersensitivity could be so disruptive that it produces substantial mental stress as the individuals attempt to cope with the limitations it produces. Another explanation may be that exposures to toxic agents can affect brain functions related to mood and emotions, the study said. Unconscionably, no MCS study was initiated by ATSDR in Alberton, a blatant failure in its investigation of the Alberton spill and of MCS in general. ATSDR exhibited zero interest in seriously studying the prevalence of MCS in Alberton spill victims, undermining victims' attempts to explain, document, and treat their symptoms, but also impacting their medical credibility in litigation. One could reasonably conclude that ATSDR chose not to document evidence of chemical sensitivity in Alberton spill victims and did not want the evidence on the record. Again, this inaction served the chemical industry well. Because the etiology of MCS is unknown and the biologic outcome variable, the primary goal of most treating doctors is usually relief of symptoms. Limited studies examining patients' assessments of treatments have found that chemical avoidance measures were rated as very highly effective, whereas prescription drugs were rated the least effective of all treatments. One study found that creating a chemical-free living space and chemical avoidance were rated by 95% of respondents as helpful. This is less a treatment than an exposure strategy. But while patients don't feel cured, chemical avoidance provides some symptomatic relief. The authors wrote, "The use of toxic materials in buildings and the ubiquitous nature of chemical exposures render most living situations unsuitable for those with MCS. The lower one's income, the fewer the options. Many people have no choice but to live in places that make them sick or to spend beyond their means to remain in safe housing. But avoidance strategies have other costs: potential social isolation and loss of employment. Many doctors do not recognize MCS or offer treatment." Allergist and immunologist Dr. Gordon Baker of Washington State, who saw some Alberton patients, wrote, "Some patients with severe reactions to toxic chemicals have been forced to see certain physicians who are uneducated about disease resulting from toxic exposures. Patients have been told to desensitize themselves to their neurosis by going back into the offending environment and exposing themselves to increasing doses of the poisons that have caused their psychological problems. This advice is unconscionable and can only aggravate what may already be an extremely serious illness," Baker wrote. Lucinda Hodges was advised to take such chemical odor immersion treatment. Others claim that MCS denial isn't just ignorance or disbelief. Dr. Ann McCampbell, chair of the Multiple Chemical Sensitivity Task Force of New Mexico, wrote in 2001, "The chemical manufacturing industry has launched an anti-MCS campaign designed to create the illusion of controversy about MCS and cast doubt on its existence, as had the tobacco industry over cancer in cigarettes." She said, "The industry uses the term controversial in framing an MCS debate while trying to get the chemical out of MCS." McCampbell said a red flag for an anti-MCS agenda is the term idiopathic environmental intolerances. In this PR, patients are crazy chemophobes, the doctor's quacks for enabling a belief, the studies flawed, and the test unreliable. The anti-MCS movement is driven by chemical manufacturers, she said. In 1990, the Chemical Manufacturers Association, now the American Chemistry Council, vowed to work to prevent the recognition of MCS out of concern for potential lost profits and increased liability if MCS were to become widely acknowledged. As of 2000, Campbell wrote, "There are over 600 articles on MCS and related conditions in the published literature, the majority of which support a physiological rather than a psychological basis for MCS in a ratio of 2-1. MCS is under siege by a well-funded and widespread disinformation campaign being waged by the chemical and pharmaceutical industries," she wrote. "Their goal is to create the illusion of controversy about MCS and cast doubt on its existence." MCS was bad news for business as usual. Many Alberton patients claimed a wide range of symptoms that appeared to fit the general criteria proposed for MCS, though few were diagnosed with MCS or even understood they might have MCS. Many, however, were diagnosed with RADS, a type of hypersensitivity. But while Alberton spill victims repeatedly claimed to ATSDR that returning to the evacuated area made them sick and exhibited hallmark symptoms of chemical hypersensitivity, ATSDR never studied hypersensitivity, MCS, or RADS. ATSDR completely sidestepped issues related to chemical sensitivity, despite that the Alberton incident was a textbook opportunity for a mass exposure study of a sort that ATSDR's own workgroup panels had repeatedly recommended. A mass exposure that was rare to come by. Intentionally or not, ATSDR did the chlorine industry a huge service at the expense of Alberton spill victims and future sufferers of MCS. Ellen Leahy was unaware that ATSDR had developed an MCS survey form, as was the EPA's Chris Weiss. However, they were both aware of sensitivity issues with Alberton victims, and Leahy informed ATSDR of acute symptoms as they surveyed victims in their Phase 1 study. Later, spill victims complained to ATSDR and the EPA repeatedly of chronic sensitivity. Hope Sieg noted, "If the federal agency does not recognize that these people have symptoms such as chemical sensitivity, then how can we expect anyone else to? How is the medical community supposed to know that these problems exist and how to treat them?" ATSDR wasn't in denial of MCS. ATSDR consciously refused to study MCS and Alberton spill victims. Wrote one analyst in 2008, "Frequent ambivalence or downright opposition within several key federal agencies hinders raising the political will to address or even to explore more fully the possibilities and implications of MCS." He concluded, "The current status of MCS is mired in an impasse between skeptics and proponents, just where the chemical industry wanted it." For Alberton victims, the lack of support and failure to legitimize symptoms helped marginalize people who sought help and explanations for their suffering, and undermine efforts to get treatment and document their illness for litigation. Next time on GAST, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we examine the relationship between Alberton chemical spill victims and the doctors who treated them, or served as witnesses against them in litigation. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.